When you think about long-running superhero cinematic universes, most like to think that it all started with Marvel. But it didn't, because in actuality, it started with Marvel.
You what?
8 years before the launch of the MCU with Iron Man, Fox tried its hand with its own Marvel property, the X-Men. The franchise would see enough success to propel it through 2 decades, with 13 installments in its lineup. Stories that pan through multiple trilogies, spin-offs, and spin-off trilogies, with actors in the parts that would define, and in some cases redefine, these characters for the next 20 years. The cast was more often than not just as gifted as the characters that they were portraying, though their longevity was clearly not by design, which is why the final product is riddled with recast characters, separate timelines, and unavoidable continuity contradictions. The series saw a lot of triumph and failure. For every Logan, there's an X-Men Origins Wolverine.
Go fuck yourself.
As a whole, I think this franchise was very a tale of two cities. The best of times, it was the worst of times. There's almost just as much to question as there is to praise, which is why I want to take a look back at this franchise from its highest of highs to its lowest of lows. So join me past Days of Future Past, back to where it all began, with 2000's X-Men. Now, it's important to remember that the first X-Men movie was made at a time when source material was often snubbed in favor of writers just doing their own thing with the blanket of a pre-established comic character.
You stupid monkey!
These movies do tend to toe the line of just doing that, but also providing a somewhat authentic experience for X-Men fans. The movie, to its credit, took its source material very seriously, at a time when it wasn't always common to do so when adapting comic media. Just 2 years before the first X-Men came out, the last Batman movie came out.
A bat credit card?
A bad credit card, you bastards! I'll kill you! I'll kill all of you! All of you!
The story was treated with respect, trying to depict comic stories as realistically as possible, taking the events from these books and then trying to set them in some semblance of reality. While this tone was beneficial to the brand, it also wound up being a little detrimental to the initial vision. It was thought at the time that the colorful costumes that the characters wore, the traits that identified them with audiences, wouldn't translate between these two mediums. This is despite the fact that several hero movies had already come out and properly portrayed the characters' looks and depicted material of a darker nature. The studio felt the need to compromise the X-Men's unique looks for identical look-alike leather Fantastic Four gear, meaning that nobody stands out aesthetically. Everyone just looks the same here, which sucks because their looks are sort of integral to the characters. I always thought this change made it feel like the X-Men lost their sense of individuality. Now they all just come off as minions of Professor X. Personally, I think this is the biggest misstep in the whole series. Even worse, they had to live by this in the sequel. I question it not just from the standpoint of accuracy, but also creatively. What benefit is there if none of your characters stand out from each other?
What would you prefer? Yellow spandex?
Yeah, dude, yes, that's what we'd all prefer. I get that this is a clever little jab at the audience in a playful manner, but it's also acknowledging what your audience wants, and then just basically going. In most cases, they sure do feel like the characters that they're based on. The obvious, of course, being the face of the franchise, Hugh Jackman's Wolverine. He plays the part perfectly, acting rough and rugged, but still capable of compassion, coming off as harsh and argumentative, but not to the point of being unlikable. Not falling in line and taking orders, but still managing to find a way to briefly be part of a team. There was a fine line Jackman had to walk to make this character work, and he walked that tightrope with ease. That's not an easy feat to achieve. Now granted, I do think that there's an animalistic quality to the character that gets lost in translation. He definitely feels much more man than he does modern day caveman like he does in the comics, especially in his first outing. Not to mention that Hugh Jackman is about a foot too tall and maybe just a bit too pretty to play the part. Nonetheless, he made it work, acting out the character's most defining traits and redefining the rest. Jackman has officially played the same hero longer than anyone else ever has. There's a reason for that. I always felt that Logan's inclusion in this movie is kinda perfect. I'd almost liken it to the man with no name. He wants no part in the plot, so the story sort of surrounds him until inevitably he's sucked into it. He's taking part in everything begrudgingly, which sort of feels right up the character's alley. He doesn't want anything to do with the X-Men or the Brotherhood. He just wants to go on about his business. It's only after he's formed a friendship with Rogue that he sticks around to ensure her safety, showing that even though he can be selfish, somehow there is a sense of selflessness to him. This much is made clear multiple times throughout the film. Firstly, when he's lured into joining the team with promises of helping him figure out his past, he's intrigued, but not enough to stick around, only fully committing to the team when Rogue needs to be saved. And ultimately, it's him who winds up doing that saving, putting himself in danger and playing a big part in freeing her. He also chooses to potentially sacrifice himself for her. While he may not carry himself like your stereotypical hero, he still has the heart of one, even if he doesn't want to admit to it. Equally well cast is the franchise's Professor X. Patrick Stewart just embodies Charles Xavier. And I'm not just speaking in the case of a more than passing resemblance. I mean, Patrick Stewart really brings this character to life, speaking always with reassuring sage-like wisdom, even when the answers are unclear to him.
You want to cut off our fingers? One finger. The finger of the first person who doesn't keep their Lenten promise. I hope it's the boy.
Why?
I envy your youth!
He's a confident leader with an extraordinary amount of power. And he's a man who understands the responsibility that comes with having that power. Despite the state of the world and mutant-human relations, Charles remains hopeful, trying to find the good even in the bad or otherwise twisted.
I'm sneaking around in here, Charles. Whatever are you looking for? I'm looking for hope.
He treats his adversaries with the level of respect one would reserve for their acquaintances. Take, for example, even when he's asked for help by someone who's done mutant-kind harm. He doesn't bat an eye in trying to help him, welcoming him into his mansion and simply saying that he's wrong about his negative outlook on mutants. Even in the end, when he's defeated his friend-turned-foe, Eric Lensher, he visits him in his imprisonment, not to gloat, but to check in, to try and inspire the hope that he was looking for in him. Professor X is wise beyond his years and kind beyond explanation. He has such a hope in humanity, despite it seemingly constantly letting him down. And Charles Xavier is so pure here. You couldn't ask for a better performance from an actor for this part. Sorry, James McAvoy, you're terrific, but I mean, everyone pales in comparison to the OGX. Which is why it's no wonder that aside from Hugh Jackman as Wolverine, it's Patrick Stewart who has returned to their role more than anyone else, appearing in 7 out of the 13 movies in this franchise, and also in one movie outside of it. Similarly, played to perfection was Ian McKellen as Magneto. Much like Professor X, he spoke in a very educated manner, though he didn't share his hope in humanity, or any of his regular philosophies. Magneto's family lived through one of the greatest atrocities in history, being split up from his family at a very young age due to very harsh circumstances. Being brought up to see the absolute worst in humanity understandably left him without trust in human nature. What I've always appreciated about this character that this portrayal perfected was showcasing the origins of Magneto's villainy. Unlike your traditional villain, his bad guy status doesn't come from some nefarious scheme of world domination. It comes out of a very real fear that a horrible history, something he'd been powerless in the past to stop, and something he refuses allowing to happen again. Magneto isn't out for revenge. He's taking what he believes are preventative measures to combat mutant erasure. Despite their differences, Magneto and Professor X have shared intents, to use their gifts to protect mutant kind. So it's not Magneto's goal that makes him a heel, it's the methods of achieving these goals that do. You can sympathize with his plight and justify his jaded nature, but you can't agree with his actions. He's hard to hate and even harder to love. But this performance is easy to admire. It's no wonder that Magneto would continue to be a staple in these movies, even when he wasn't being utilized as the movie's main villain. With this one outstanding performance, he became just as integral as any of the heroes. Because the truth is, for as important as Magneto is to the whole premise of X-Men, you can still very easily tell an X-Men story without the character. The same way that you can easily tell a Batman story without the Joker. I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say that I think that the Brotherhood of Mutants only returned as often as they did because they were being led by him. I think if there was another actor in this role initially, that probably wouldn't be the case. It certainly wasn't commonplace at the time to bring back the big bad for the sequel, but I'm really glad that they did. Ian McKellen shared an incredible chemistry with Patrick Stewart. The two truly came off as people who knew each other on an almost familial level. It already feels like the two are forever connected. A friendship born through a bond based on similar trials and tribulations. Two friends forced to go down separate paths due to principles and beliefs. Despite their conflicting philosophies and their constant struggles, they don't ever truly become enemies, but instead respected opponents. You get the feeling that if either man had it their way, they'd be working side by side to achieve their objective. Magneto's henchmen are some of the most underloved and underrated aspects of this movie. The Brotherhood of Mutants would appear continually throughout these films, but their ranks were constantly changing. Members would come and go in between movies very often. And for a while, they were bringing in new mutants with each new installment, each lineup being less impressive than the last. But for my money, this is the greatest lineup of the group in all of these films. The team consisting of Sabretooth, Toad, and Mystique. Which is really just a stellar lineup as is. But the brief insight we get into the group's dynamics are always fun. Each part I think is played relatively well. Though, in saying that, I will admit that there's not a lot asked of those playing these parts. For example, Ray Park plays Toad, and while the character looks sick, he gets all of 4 lines throughout the whole film. Still, we have a pretty good idea of who Toad is as a character with just those 4 lines. He's an obnoxious annoyance who is just as repulsive on the inside as he is on the outside. And I love it. Once again, aesthetically, this character doesn't really resemble what he's based on. And while I do kinda miss the Hunchback, I'm gonna go ahead and say that I think this look is a rare upgrade in terms of appearance. While Toad was missing his Hunchback, Mystique was missing her clothing. Gone was her goddess-like gown, and in its place were blue scales that covered her head to toe. And you know what? I'm gonna go ahead and say again, this is a look that I really liked. It wasn't identical to the character from the comics. I don't know that I'd call it an improvement to the original look, but it does feel like an actual adaptation of that look. It worked in context of these films, and just generally speaking, I think it's a solid character design. Appearance aside, Mystique comes off as a deadly femme fatale, who serves as the right hand of Magneto, which is a little different from how the comics would portray her, making her much more of a leader than a second-in-command. Regardless, Rebecca Romijn always felt intimidating and unpredictable in the part. She had a stoic nature to her that made everything she did feel like it was a well-thought-out certainty. Despite being second-in-command, she felt dominant in almost every given situation. There was definitely a difference between how she and her 2 cohorts were depicted. Sabretooth and Toad were definitely treated as underlings, whereas she was treated much more like an equal to Magneto. Speaking of Sabretooth, the parts of the Wolverine character that were played down were amped up with this movie's portrayal of Sabretooth. His animalistic nature was not only still intact, but was amplified. He wasn't very bright, but he was very violent, a brute who was much more beast than he was man. Similar to their Brotherhood siblings, I was a fan of Sabretooth in this movie. I mean, sure, he looked like the Cowardly Lion went primal, but I thought it was an interesting choice trading in the mane for a jacket with that mane. It's one of the rare cases where I agree with the change made, and the argument of trying to legitimize the look. As a matter of fact, if creative decisions like this were made on the rest of the cast's costumes, I could at least appreciate it a little bit more. With Sabretooth, it literally looks like they took the character from the comics and created a creative workaround to make that character stay in the same vein as the original design. It's not ideal for a perfect adaptation, but it's at least an attempt at adapting. I mean, they just threw the entire team in pleather one pieces and called it a day. I'm sorry, that's not the point I was trying to make here, but it's still weighing on my mind. I really enjoy all the clashes between Wolverine and Sabretooth. It's fun to watch two characters of a similar barbarian nature battle it out. Their unique abilities lend to creative choreography and provide interesting and innovative ways of combating each other's offense. Their similar set of skills and their opposing alignment make the two feel like natural enemies. Their dynamic isn't really explained here, but I would say it's properly expressed. To be honest, I really thought they dropped the ball here on writing the bad guy off so quickly, and deciding against bringing him back for the sequels. Though they would eventually try to right this wrong at some point in the future, bringing the character back for a prequel in the past. But we'll get into that later. Again, these characters aren't given a whole lot of attention, as their primary function is just to be pawns of Magneto's plans. Still, nonetheless, I found them to be highly entertaining additions to the movie, despite them feeling a bit underdeveloped. Another character who's underappreciated by both fans of the movies and the people making them is James Marsden as Cyclops. He looks identical to the character from the comic book panels, and he does the role justice. When not taking orders from the professor, he's out on the field giving them, acting like the team leader he is, and these movies would never make him out to be. There's so little shown of him in this role, and I think that's mainly due to just how many characters in this story there are. The plot's constantly introducing characters, trying to explain them, and then keep up with their story throughout. So Scott just gets lost in the shuffle. He's one of many main characters inevitably pushed to the background, which is a real shame, as this character should always be in the forefront.
Well, then I guess you've got nothing to worry about, do you?
I mean, he is one of the leading X-Men. Despite not getting the screen time or development a lot of the other characters got, Cyclops still feels integral to the team, in spite of not actually feeling important to the plot. Unfortunately for this specific story, Cyclops is really just depicted as being Jean Grey's angry boyfriend. He's attached to the main character through virtue of being the other guy. Narratively, not a great place to be. Jean Grey is given a lot more attention in these films, but even in saying that, that's only because Wolverine has taken a liking to her. Experiment X takes one look at her and is smitten. He doesn't care if she has reservations, a boyfriend, or even if she's possessed by a cosmic entity.
You're supposed to hit her. Damn right I'm gonna hit that. God damn it.
This isn't really built up all that well, if I'm being honest. It just kinda happens. Which is fine if this was just based on attraction. You know, you like what you like. But near future installments will depict this as being a true romance with more than surface level feelings. As a matter of fact, this movie ends with Logan telling Jean,
You can tell her my heart belongs to someone else.
Huh?
but like, do you though? Cause that just seems out of nowhere. You don't really know each other. But in his defense, I guess when you're an amnesiac, you don't really know anybody, so you make do. Even stranger is that throughout the movie, it starts to seem like feelings are being reciprocated. This is once again in spite of the fact that she's dating Scott, and he spends most of his screen time at her side. When it comes to the character's depiction, it's well acted, but not thoroughly thought out. It doesn't feel like a lot of effort was put into the character overall. Like Scott, it's another case of a main character's character getting lost in a mess of mutants. She's a well-meaning, highly intelligent human being, with a heart as big as her brain, an outspoken advocate for mutant rights, fighting to save her people both on the battlefield and in the courtroom. The character would be utilized a little bit better as time went on, but not by much. By far, I would have to say that she was one of the most underdeveloped parts of this movie, and come to think of it, of the entire first trilogy. Still, her inclusion does lead to a lot of other solid developments, like heavily contributing to the Wolverine-Cyclops feud. While she plays an integral role in that, there seemed to just be a general disliking and at least one-sided disdain before Jean ever entered the picture. It was hate at first sight, which I kinda loved, by the way. They don't even know each other yet, and there's already animosity, almost as if it was predestined that these two have these problems. Outside of her role in the life of our lead, she feels about as fleshed out as Iceman. Iceman, who is prominently featured primarily in the background in a B-plot of one of our leads. I was always a fan of Shawn Ashmore in this role. He has a look that I feel suits the character, and he plays the part pretty earnestly, coming off as a total Boy Scout, which felt in line with the character I was familiar with. Now granted, at the time this came out, I was really only familiar with the Iceman from Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, but, this held up to that. Lastly, I want to credit the movie's forgotten villain, Senator Kelly. Much like Magneto, the movie doesn't portray the character as evil. He is people fear what they don't understand personified, showing a great concern for what mutants are capable of, feeling that the mere existence of mutants is a hazard to humanity, trying to create and legislate a mutant registry, enforcing that mutants identify themselves to the public. Much like Magneto, he's a man using and abusing his power out of fear of being powerless to the opposition. Maybe the man means well, but his idea of what's right was wrong to so many, endangering the lives of men, women, and children everywhere, all done in an effort to make himself feel more safe. On one hand, he's right. Mutants do pose a potential threat, but that possible problem shouldn't be treated as an absolute certainty and already existing issue. The safety of some shouldn't come at the expense of the safety of others. With such anti-mutant rhetoric out at the time, it would seem like forcibly identifying one would be greatly endangering them. It would be the modern-day equivalent to the Salem witch trials. I wouldn't say that he hates mutants. I just think he's deeply uncomfortable and unnerved at the idea of sharing an Earth with far more powerful beings. When he's forcibly turned into a mutant using Magneto's device, he reaches out to Xavier's School for the Gifted, looking for Jean Grey, looking for help. He speaks to those there without bigotry or malice, even shares some interesting last moments with Storm, where it seems like the two somewhat understand each other, as both fear the opposite side and what they're capable of doing to them. I think there's something really interesting about this presentation, showing both sides of the argument and how scary the power the other has can be to somebody on the other side. Bruce Davison makes the Senator feel like a bad guy who means well, a misguided man who's trying to ensure his own survival. Though there's a wrinkle to that story that I'll cover a little bit later. With that being said, this movie also had some miscasting. All due respect to Anna Paquin, but I've never understood the decision to have her play Rogue, but have Rogue in the place of Jubilee. Now, narratively, this was done to better help the two characters connect. Rogue's powers come the inability to get close to anyone, something that she and Logan share. Somewhat understanding her plight, Logan is able to sympathize, which further humanizes his character. Despite coming off as a constant jerk, the character does in fact have a heart, and the two share a friendship that ranges from a father-daughter relationship to a big sibling-little sibling bond. So speaking for this specific narrative, that change works well, though I believe this comes at the expense of the actual character. Rogue's characterization in these movies is a great misrepresentation of her character. In the comics, she's got a whole lot of personality. She's smart, she's sarcastic, she's sassy, she's a go-getter, she's in your face. And when she has an attitude, she's not shy of showing it. These movies offer up the total opposite of that. And I think the big problem here is that they never needed her character, they just needed her powers to tell the story. It almost feels like the actual interesting characters from the comics is now replaced with some generic stand-in, who just so happens to have the same powers. Now granted, her powers do wind up heavily playing into the plot past that, as we're led to believe that Magneto wants Wolverine for some reason, when in actuality the man with the adamantium skeleton was just an obstacle for him to get to Rogue, though not much of one. Magneto has a master plan utilizing his abilities, but it would mean sacrificing himself, something that he's not all that Quicksilver to do. So since Rogue absorbs powers, he plans on using her as a sacrificial lamb to power his mutant-making machine. Which is a solid reason for this character's inclusion, but it's yet again a reason primarily based on the powers rather than the person with those powers. And because of that, I feel like this character never got past feeling like a glorified plot point. And while because of this she felt needed in the first movie, it's also because of this that she never felt necessary in the second or the third, with her inclusion in those films feeling like it came from obligation. Not only was the character not treated like the character, but she was hardly ever treated like a character at all. She's just some scared kid with some scary powers. It felt like she was a talking MacGuffin who stuck around for a little bit too long. And likewise, Halle Berry was a really poor choice for Storm. Nothing against Halle Berry as an actress, but she just wasn't the right person for this part. Like many others in the film, ultimately she's just sorta there. Even in her returning for 3 additional films, I don't think she ever once makes all that much of an impression. I do think the character gets better with each new installment, but even by time her story meets an end, it just doesn't feel like anything to write home about. Storm needed a much stronger presence, played by somebody with the ability to speak with the utmost confidence, and an actual African accent.
She's alright. She's just upset.
Now in this first movie, an attempt was definitely made, with Berry delivering her lines in a very inconsistent manner. I think the problem was probably spotted in production, as she's not using that accent for half of her screen time.
She's just upset.
Needless to say, while Berry would return for the sequels, the sounds that she was making here did not. Which is good because, if you're that bad at it, why even try?
About 17. My height.
Apparently a lot of the extras were also asked to come back for the sequels, just to better connect everything and make it feel like it took place in an actual school. Which is a nice detail, until you remember that a lot of the cast gets changed in between sequels. Several in this movie, as a matter of fact. Kitty Pryde makes a cameo here, but in her next cameo, she'd be played by someone else. And then by time the third one came around, she'd play a part in the plot and be played this time by then actress Ellen Page. Colossus in the first film would be played in a blink-and-you-miss-it appearance by an actor named Donald McKinnon. That role would end up being taken over by another actor named Donald Cudmore, who would go on to play the part for the next 2 movies and in Days of Future Past. Actor Alexander Burton would play Pyro in the first film in a very minor part, before the role would be recast and made more prominent in follow-up films, this time being played by Aaron Stanford. Jubilee appears in this movie once again in a blink-and-you'll-miss-it moment, but this role would be given to a different actress for the next 2 films, and then eventually played by Lana Condor in the fixed timeline. Now granted, there were more recasts such as Toad, Cyclops, Jean Grey, Mystique, Storm, Professor X, Magneto, but all of that has less to do with inconsistency and more to do with taking place at different points in the timeline. The story is simple but sweet. It's actually sort of brilliant in its simplicity. It's not very complicated, but it involves characters that are. Magneto wants to reshape the world in the image of mutant kind, smiting those he feels most wronged by, while also providing a new understanding, not by killing them, but instead by turning them into what they hate the most. Mutants. So he manages to make a machine that mutates genes, to which he himself serves as the key. But as this piece of technology is really experimental, the humans are unable to survive following their mutations. Not that Magneto would lose sleep over something like that. No one involved in the plot is exactly evil. There are people who do good, and people who do bad, but mean good. While the story structure is basic, the characters are a lot more complex. Not all people are good, and not all mutants are bad. This isn't your standard good guy versus bad guy. It shows how more often than not, perceived righteousness could fuel horrendous atrocity. Which is sort of the theme here. Everyone's the good guy in their own story, but it doesn't mean your peers or history will see things the same. Because this movie is the first in its lineup, a lot of the characters come off as much more vague and hollow versions of the characters they'd one day become. That's not really a complaint, as you need to first have a blueprint for the character before you could further develop it. That's just a statement. And I think that this was a good starting point for all these characters and for this universe overall, though admittedly some of these portrayals never moved past that starting point. X-Men is also heavy into exposition. It's constantly trying to explain itself to its audience. In terms of the characters' origins, I think the movie does just enough in explaining everyone's past. We see just enough to get an understanding of their upbringing and their place in the plot. The opening gives us the tragedy of Magneto in being separated from his family during the reign of the Third Reich. We see the plight of Rogue in not being able to get close to others, feeling constantly alone and isolated even when she's in a room with many, never truly being able to connect to another. We get glimpses into the scattered memories of Wolverine, And even Mystique has a moment where she mentions living in fear of people from a very early age. But I believe this movie's true brilliance shows itself not in the dialogue that puts over the past and lays out the story, but rather the unspoken ways in which it gets its story across. With Magneto relating to Logan, or at least making a mental comparison, when he sees the numbers assigned to Logan on his dog tag, before subtly looking down at the numbers that were forced onto his arm. Or in that very same scene, showing off the character's strength by having him seamlessly working Newton's cradle while not even paying attention to it. When this movie is silent, it manages to speak volumes. Sure, it goes a little too overboard on explaining its lore to its audience. I mean, they're pulling out all the stops. World building through reminiscing, explaining pre-established character dynamics and relationships, and getting across general concepts to the audience. They're constantly world building through reminiscing. It does a good job of establishing itself in the world that it takes place in. Now, because this movie was trying to set up the story with no regards to the future of the franchise, not even knowing if there would be a future or a franchise, a lot of what's established in this movie, and in the follow-up, would be undone in future installments. First by inconsistent writing and creative visions, and then later as a plot device. Though I'm not going to complain about all the inconsistencies now. Let's save that for when these discrepancies come up later. For now, all this has to be in canon with is itself. This movie was iconic in its own, and for better or worse, or both, it's responsible for the way the rest of these movies would be made. This movie was a love letter to the X-Men. How else can you explain them giving a part to the actor that played Beast in X-Men the Animated Series?
Where are we? I thought you said you were going to take me as far as Laughlin City.
This is Laughlin City.
That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet.
This was a passion project and a love letter to the X-Men mythos. It did its best to properly portray the material in the most serious manner that it could, sometimes to a fault. I think this movie, and these movies in general, were essential stepping stones for the superhero movie. While X-Men wasn't always an ideal adaptation, it's hard to argue that it didn't share the heart of the original, even when its head seemed to be elsewhere. So that was the first X-Men movie. So if you enjoyed this deep dive and would like to see me take on the next installment, let me know in the comment section below by leaving a comment saying,
"You bought X-Men pajamas?"
I am vengeance. I am the night, and that was V Infuso. Just remember, if you're not tuning in, then you're missing out.
So, if you like the words that came out of his mouth hole, and you too would like to become a V-generate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, nerds!
And if you're not joining the fun, you're in for one bad day. And you know what they say about having one bad day?
Catch him next time. Same bat time, same bat channel.